All right, it's roster breakdown time. Finch here, and we have a lot of great rosters to talk about moving into Season 6 of Smite, and I'll make sure I get to all of them in due time. Thank you so much for watching. Again, if you want to follow me on Twitter, HighResFinch is where I be. I do also stream, sometimes at those times, almost certainly not consistently though. So maybe if you all follow to put some pressure on me to actually, do my job and stream consistently. But the roster breakdowns, man, I mean, when we saw some of that stuff behind the scenes, but it wasn't, finalized. When those roster announcements finally came out, I was so excited for them. I mean, it was better than what I could have hoped for. I think that there are very few weak teams out there in general, like teams that I think that just can't do anything. The EU NA mixing is awesome, but there is still some that are just EU and some that are just still NA. So you have a little bit of that identity still in the scene. You get kind of both, right? You get the homogenous mixture, but you also get some of it that kind of sticks together. So I'm so excited for what Season 6 is going to bring. And starting with these roster breakdowns, I absolutely, positively had to start with the Pittsburgh Knights, right? I mean, I would have been crucified if I went anywhere else, it feels like, because this team feels like a super team, don't they? I mean, look at this talent lineup. Vote, Emilzy, Zeros, Adapting, and Deathwalker, each one of them with a legitimate claim to best player in the world status, especially in a world where we don't have Emily or Yaman. So it's hard to pick anyone to beat this team, right? Maybe Splice, as they just won the World Championship, but not against this team. I mean, it's crazy. I think the sky is certainly the limit for the roster, and I'll go into a little bit more about what I can expect for them. But first, I mean, I'm hyped for Pittsburgh Knights as an org existing, and it's crazy, right? That they're new to our scene. They're not ingrained in Smite or anything like that. They're not from us like Rival or something like that, an org that started here. But they're going to come in. They're going to make their debut with possibly the best team Smite's ever had. I mean, very possibly. It's difficult, I think, to be better than, Season 3 Energy. I mean, that's an insanely good team. Epsilon, whatever they were at that time. But if there's a team that can do it, I think it might be this Pittsburgh Knights roster. So I'm excited that this org, which I think has a ton of legitimacy, right? Backed by the Pittsburgh Steelers, they're sort of coming from this new area in esports where they're pairing a little bit with traditional sports, which I think is really cool. I'm a huge traditional sports fan as well, so I like to see this type of thing. And just looking over, some of the communications they've had, some of their webpage and stuff, very professional facing. So I'm really excited about what the org is going to bring. But I know you guys want to hear about these players, and how do you not want to talk about them? I mean, the Vote Emilzy duo lane is hype. Deathwalker, best solo laner in the world, is insanely hype as well. But there's no way in the world that I cannot start with Zeros and Adapting, the mid-jungle synergy, because that's what's going to make this whole thing work, right? Normally, super teams don't work. I mean, Dignitas was a super team when they went together, and to say they didn't work is unfair. They're insanely good, and the second most consistent team, I would say, across the 2-year span, probably Rival would beat them out. But they had a hard time, I feel like, closing. And I've said this multiple times. Yes, second place is insanely good, you're right, but that was a team with enough talent to be first all the time. And it wasn't like they were getting there and they were being beaten by world beaters. They would get there and it felt like they would beat themselves sometimes. Super Regionals comes to mind. Spring LAN comes to mind, where there were just errors from that roster. So if super teams, if there's a precedent for them struggling, then that does temper the expectation for Pittsburgh Knights a bit. Maybe if it wasn't Adapting in Zeros, maybe it would. That's why that mid-jungle synergy or the mid-jungle pairing is so nuts, right? I mean, Adapting, of course, perhaps our best player of all time, certainly a top-tier jungler, if not the best jungler. Cuvo Fred, maybe, I think, could occasionally take that title from him. They go back and forth, but Adapting is just the guy. If you're picking one jungler on any given, Friday, it's Adapting that you take, right? I mean, he's just that good. And now you're pairing him with Zeros, who I think was the best mid laner in the world. Him and Yaman were back and forth. So not only are these two players without Yaman in the league, now he's unequivocally is the best mid laner, but their relative scale on this roster change is not going to be dramatic at all. If Adapting's used to having Yaman as his backup, well, now you got Zeros. I mean, that's not much of a change at all in terms of capability. And the same vice versa. Cuvo Fred to Adapting, you're still going to be getting someone who's an absolute monster mechanically backing you up. And these two players both love to play aggressively. There would be times when Yaman as great as he was, would like to play a little bit more calculated, it felt like, and then adapting. He was always there to follow up, sure, but now these two going full throttle, good luck other mid-junglers out there. If you're not Sino and Moswall, RIP, man. I mean, because the mid lane pool is pretty shallow as it is right now, so hard for me to imagine that Zero's gonna have an advantage in every single game, and that he's not, and that adapting is not like bouncing off that every single game and they're not ahead. That, I think, is a great spot to think about where this team is almost certainly going to be ahead of everyone else. Now, if duo lane pressure is as important in Season 6 as it was in, like, towards the end of Season 5, maybe that mitigates it some, but the mid-junglers are able to rotate over. They're kind of the ones who can decide who wins the duo lane when you think about it. The jungler, how much presence they spend in the duo lane. Do they want to gank? Even if you don't get the kill, if you force them to stay back at their tower line, if you don't let them feel comfortable coming up to their buffs, you can just manufacture a lead in the duo lane. That's what having Zeros and adapting could do for you. Perma control of mid jungle means perma control of duo. That's how you win your games. I mean, it's going to be difficult, I think, to beat this Pittsburgh Knight roster just starting from there. And you're not just there. You have Emilzy and Vote. Two other players who have their hats in the ring for best in the world. I mean, Arkle probably is someone that you could say up there with Vote. Cyclone Spin right now as well, but Emil, you don't have to worry about him outclassing Vote here at this point. I mean, this guy's insane. And he's always played with Collis, right? Someone who's incredibly aggressive in the dual lane. I don't think he'll quite have that from Emilzy. Emilzy is a little bit like I was saying with Yemen. He's a little bit more calculated. He'll make big highlight risky plays, blinking underneath towers, and trying to find roots, pulls when he's on things like Sylvanas, trying to set up for the rest of his team, burning relics, and knowing that he can get back out safely. So those plays will exist, but it won't be quite the same as when Vote was playing with Collis. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Like I said, you don't necessarily need to get your duo lane pressure from playing Ares every single game. It can be from having wave control, from having buff control, from being the team that's able to have your jungler over there more often, or even if you're Splice, bringing your solo laner over at level 1, right? So it doesn't have to come from direct lane aggression in lane from playing aggressive gods. And Emilzy can do that same thing on gods like Sylvanas, on gods like Terra, and set up for Vote. So I think this duo lane, with their capability, with the mind that Emilzy has for the game, they'll be in a really good spot. And if that sort of meta and dual lane changes, I trust someone like Emilzy to be able to adapt to it quickly, if not be at the forefront of why it changes in the first place. This is a scary dual lane when you put not just their raw talent out there, but their ability to think about the game preemptively and reactively, whichever one it is that team needs. And then somehow I've saved the nutcase, the maniac for last. Pardon the pun, in Deathwalker. I mean, this guy is just the best. For a while, it was Benji, right? For a while, you were like, well, maybe Benji is right there with Deathwalker 1A, 1B. Divios, I think, could be in that conversation as well. After the performance that he had, especially in Summer Split, Divios was keeping the Splice really relevant, even when they weren't that great of a team, and I'll certainly talk more about them when I go into their video on its own. But man, this Deathwalker guy just gets it done. And it's in a time when solo laners are less independently relevant than they once were. I think that's going to change with Season 6. There's going to be some ways to benefit from solo lane pressure more than before. So that immediately skyrockets Deathwalker's stock up because he can get solo lane pressure no matter who he's playing, it feels like. So when you add in the fact that he's often able to win his lane no matter who he's up against and makes meaningful, smart rotations really, really well. It's one thing just to sit in the solo lane and proxy. It's another thing when you have Deathwalker's game sense to when he knows when he can pair up with adapting and Zeros to make something happen in mid, to start stripping away buffs, to try and get themselves a little bit more control elsewhere. It's just this constantly flowing waterfall of issues if you're going up against Pittsburgh Knight. Because where do you go to try and win your lane? Where do you go to try and establish pressure? Where do you go to try and stop the bleeding? There's no weak links on this team. There's no holes. There's in the armor. There's no weaknesses. I don't know where you go. So we'll have to see. Maybe the weakness could be communication. This team is new together. A lot of teams are new together. A lot of teams are not. Space Station, Trifecta, and Splice all sticking together. So there's certainly some teams that won't have that barrier. But If they can overcome that, which these players are all veteran enough and capable enough to absolutely do, plus they have two members who are sticking together in Vote, Deathwalker, and then Emilzy and Adapting, so those individual pieces of synergy will still be there. They'll be collecting and mushing it together as 5. Then I think they don't have much to worry about. And it's not like you're going up against a team like Rival who's better than the sum of its parts anyway. The teams that are the scariest in terms of sticking together, I think, are Splice and Trifecta because they play so well as a unit anyway. So as long as they can hang with those two teams, then I don't think you even have to worry about their synergy. Pittsburgh Knights, for me, the sky is the limit. It is difficult not to put them as number 1 right there with Splice based on the performance that Splice had last year and just the name power that this team has. I mean, buy the Pittsburgh Knights stocks, you know, sell the family dog or whatever it is to get your Knights stock, because I think this team really is going to be good.